Chapter 14, Thirst, from Laura Hillenbrand's book Unbroken. Phil felt as if he were on fire. The equatorial sun lay upon the men, scalding their skin. Their upper lips burned and cracked, ballooning so dramatically that they obstructed their nostrils, while their lower lips bulged against their chins. Their bodies were slashed with open cracks that formed under the corrosive onslaught of sun, salt, wind, and fuel residue. White caps slapped into the fissures, waves, I guess. A sensation that Louis compared to having alcohol poured onto a wound. Sunlight glared off the ocean, sending barbs of white light into the men's pupils and leaving their heads pounding. The men's feet were catered with quarter-sized salt sores, the rafts baked along with their occupants, emitting a bitter smell. The water cans were empty. Desperately thirsty and overheated, the men could do no more than use their hands to bail seawater over themselves. The coolness of the ocean beckoned and couldn't be answered, for the shark circled. One shark, 6 or 8 feet long, stalked the rafts without rest, day and night. The men became especially wary of him, and when he ventured too close, one of them would jab him with an oar. On the third day, without water, a smudge appeared on the horizon. It grew, darkened, billowed over the rafts, and lidded the sun. Down came the rain. The men threw back their heads, spilled their bodies back, and spread their arms and opened their mouths. The rain fell on their chests, lips, face, and tongues. It soothed their skin, washed the salt and sweat from the fuel, and fuel from their pores, slid down their throats, felt through their bodies, and it was a sensory explosion. They knew it wouldn't last. They had to find a way to save the water. The narrow water tins, open to the downpour, caught virtually nothing. Louis, keeping his head tipped up and his mouth open, felt around the raft for something better. He dug into the raft pockets and pulled out one of the air pumps. It was sheltered in a canvas case about 14 inches long. Stitched down one side, he tore the seam open, spread the fabric to form a triangle bowl, and watched happily as the rain pooled on the fabric. He had collected some 2 pints of water when a whitecap crashed into the raft, crested over, and slopped into the canvas, spoiling the water. Not only had the most productive part of the storm been wasted, but the canvas had to be rinsed in the rain before Louis could resume capturing water. Even when that was done, there was no way to avoid the next whitecap, because Louis couldn't see them coming. Louis tried a new technique. Instead of allowing large pools of water to gather, he began continuously sucking the captured water into his mouth and spitting it into the cans. Once the cans were full, he kept harvesting the rain, giving one man a drink every 30 seconds or so. They tore open the second pump case to form another rain catcher. When the sun emerged, they found that the canvas cases also made excellent hats. They began rotations with them, 2 men in, 1 man out. The men were ravenous. It was now clear that Mac's binge on the chocolate, which had seemed only moderately worrisome at the time, was a catastrophe. Louis resented Mac, and Mac seemed to know it. Though Mac never spoke of it, Louis sensed that he was consumed with guilt over what he had done. As hunger bleated inside them, the men experienced a classic symptom of starvation, the inability to direct their thoughts away from food. They stared into the ocean, undulating with edible creatures, but without bait they couldn't catch even a minnow. Occasionally a bird passed, always out of reach. The men studied their shoes and wondered if they could eat the leather. They decided they couldn't. Days passed. Each evening, the roasting heat gave way to cold. Sleep was elusive. Phil, alone in his raft and lacking the heat of another man to warm the water around him, suffered particularly badly. He shook through each night, too cold to sleep. In the daytime, exhaustion, heat, and the lolling of the raft made all of them drowsy. They slept through much of each day and spent the rest lying back, saving their precious, evaporated energy. It occurred to Phil that from the point of view of the birds, their still forms, obscured by canvas hoods, must have looked like lifeless debris. He was right. One day, 9 or 10 days into their odyssey, Louis felt something alight on his hood, and he saw the shadow fall before him. It was an albatross. With Louis's head hidden, the bird hadn't recognized that he was landing on a man. Slowly, Louis raised his hand toward the bird, his motion so gradual that it was little more noticeable than the turning of a minute hand on a clock. The bird rested calmly. In time, Louis's hand was beside the bird, his fingers open. All at once, Louis snapped his hand shut, clamped down on the bird's leg, and the bird pecked frantically, slashing his knuckles. Louis grabbed his head and broke its neck. Louis used the pliers to tear the bird open. A gust of fetid odor rose from the body, and all 3 men recoiled. Louis handed a bit of meat to Phil and Mac and took one for himself. The stench hung before them, spurring waves of nausea. Gagging, they couldn't get the meat into their mouths. Eventually, they gave up. Though they couldn't eat the bird, they finally had bait. Louis took out the fishing gear, tied a small hook to a line, baited it, and fed it into the water. In a moment, a shark cruised by, bit down on the hook, and severed the line, taking the bait, the hook, and a foot or two of line with him. Louis tried with another hook, and again a shark took it. A third try produced the same result. Finally, the sharks let a hook hang unmolested. Louis felt a tug and pulled up the line. On its end hung a slender pilot fish about 10 inches long. As Louis pulled it apart, everyone felt apprehensive. None of them had eaten raw fish before. They each put a bit of meat into their mouths. It was flavorless. They ate it down to the bones. It was the first food to cross their lips in more than a week. Between three men, a small fish didn't go far, but the protein gave them a push of energy. Louis had demonstrated that if they were persistent and resourceful, they could catch food, and both he and Phil felt inspired. Only Mac remained unchanged. Phil felt uneasy about the albatross. Like many schoolboys of his era, he had read Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. In the poem, a sailor kills a friendly albatross that, it is said, had made the winds blow. In consequence, the sailor and his crew are stranded in an infernal, windless waters, tormented by thirst and monstrous creatures. The crewmen all die, and the sailor is left in a hellish limbo. The albatross hung around his neck, his eyes closed against the accusing stares of the dead crewmen. Louis wasn't superstitious, but he'd grown fond of albatrosses on that Christmas he'd spent watching them crash land on Midway. He felt sorry for the bird. Phil reminded Louis that killing an albatross was said to bring bad luck. After a plane crash, Louis replied, what more bad luck could they have? Several more days passed. Louis caught nothing, and his hook supply dwindled. No more birds landed on the raft. Periodically, rain replenished the water tins, but only part way. The men floated in a sensory vacuum. When the weather was calm, the ocean was silent. There was nothing to touch but water, skin, hair, and canvas. Other than the charred smell of the raft, there was no other odors. There was nothing to look at but sky and sea. At some point, Louis stuck his finger in his ear and felt wax there. He smelled his finger, and by virtue of being new, the sense of wax was curiously refreshing. He developed a habit of twisting his finger in his ear and sniffing it. Phil and Mac began doing it too. When Louis slept, he dreamed of being on land, trying to sleep, but there was never a place to rest safely, only rocks, sucking mud, a bed of cactus. He would be on a perilous cliff of unstable boulders, and the ground would have and shift under his weight. Phil was having the same dreams. As time passed, Phil began thinking about an article written by World War I ace pilot Eddie Rickenbacker that he had read in Life magazine that winter. The previous October, a B-17 carrying Rickenbacker and a crew over the Pacific had become lost and run out of fuel. The pilot had ditched the plane and it had floated long enough for the men to get into rafts. The men had drifted for weeks, surviving on stores in the rafts, rainwater, fish, and bird meat. One man had died and the rest had hallucinated, babbling at invisible companions, singing bizarre songs, arguing about where to pull over the imaginary car which they were riding. This was the other guys at the raft that they had heard about before they got in the raft. One lieutenant had been visited by a specter who had tried to lure him to the bottom of the ocean. Finally, the rafts had split up and one had reached an island. Natives had radioed to Funafuti and the other men had been rescued. It seemed that Rickenbacker's crew had stretched the capacity for human survival as far as it would go. Rickenbacker had written that he had drifted for 21 days. He had actually drifted for 24. And Phil, Louis, and Mac believed that this was a survival record. In fact, the record for an inflated raft survival appears to have been set in 1942 when 3 Navy plane crash victims survived for 34 days on the Pacific before reaching an island where they were sheltered by the natives. There was one other. In 1942, Poom Lim survived for 133 days alone on a raft after the ship was sunk by a German submarine. 133 days alone. Lim's feat was a record, but his vessel was a large wood and metal Carly float boat raft equipped with 10 gallons of water, a fair amount of food, an electric torch, and other supplies. 133 days alone on the ocean. Rickenbacker's story, familiar to Louis also, was important for another reason. Exposure, dehydration, stress, and hunger had quickly driven many of Rickenbacker's party insane. a common fate for raft-bound men. Louis was more concerned about sanity than he was about sustenance. He kept thinking of a college philosopher, a college, what's that word? He kept thinking about a college class he had taken in which the instructor had taught them to think of a mind as a muscle that would atrophy if let idle. Louis was determined that no matter what happened to their bodies, their minds would stay under their control. Within a few days of the crash, Louis began peppering the other two with questions on every conceivable subject. Phil took up the challenge, and soon he and Louis turned the raft into a non-stop quiz show. They shared their histories from first memories onward, recounted in minute detail. Louis told of his days at USC. Phil spoke of Indiana. They recalled the best dates they ever had. They told and retold stories of practical jokes that they played on each other. Every answer was followed by a question. Phil sang church hymns. Louis taught the other two the lyrics to White Christmas, and they sang it over the ocean, a holiday song in June. The only audience was the circling sharks. Every conversation meandered back to food. Louis had often boasted to Phil about his mother's cooking, and at some point Phil asked Louis to describe how she made a meal. Louis began describing a dish, and all three men found it satisfying, so Louis kept going, telling them about each dish in the greatest possible detail. Soon, Louis's kitchen floated with them. Sauces simmered, Louis's kitchen floated there with them. Sauces simmered, spices were pinched and scattered, butter melted on tongues. So began a 3-day ritual on the raft, with pumpkin pie and spaghetti being the favorite subjects. The men came to know Louis's recipes so well that if Louis skipped a step or forgot an ingredient, Phil, and sometimes Mac, would quickly correct him and make him start over. When the imaginary meal was prepared, the men would devour every crumb, describing each mouthful. They conjured up the scene in such vivid detail that somehow their stomachs were fooled by it, if only briefly. That's good to know. Once the food was eaten and the past exhausted, they moved to the future. Louis laid plans to buy the Torrance train depot and turn it into a restaurant. Phil fantasized about getting back to Indiana, maybe to teach school. He couldn't wait to see the Indy 500 again. The race had been suspended because of the war, but Phil revived it in his mind, spreading a blanket on the infield grass, heaping it with food, and watching the cars blur past. Zoom, zoom. And he thought about Cece. It hadn't occurred to him to tuck his picture in his wallet before he left the cottage, but in his mind, she never left him. For Louis and Phil, the conversations were healing, pulling them out of their suffering and setting the future before them as a concrete thing. As they imagined themselves back in the world again, they willed a happy ending to their ordeal and made it their expectation. With these talks, they created something to live for. In all these bull sessions, not once did they broach the subject of the crash. Louis wanted to talk about it, but something about Phil stopped him. There were times when Phil seemed lost in troubled thoughts, and Louis guessed that he was reliving the crash and perhaps holding himself responsible for the deaths of his men. Louis wanted to reassure Phil that he'd done nothing wrong, but he decided that raising the issue would deepen Phil's preoccupation, so he said nothing. As Louis and Phil grilled each other, Mac usually sat in silence. Sometimes he'd ask Louis to describe a recipe, or occasionally he would interject, but getting him to fully participate was rough going. He shared a few memories, and though the other two encouraged him, he couldn't imagine a future. To him, it seemed the world was too far gone. Given the dismal record of raft-bound men, Mac's despair was reasonable. What is remarkable is that the two men who shared Mac's plight didn't share the hopelessness. Though Phil was constantly wondering how long this would go on, it had not yet occurred to him that he might die. The same was true for Louis. Though they both knew that they were in an extremely serious situation, both had the ability to warn fear away from their thoughts, focusing instead on how to survive and reassuring themselves that things would eventually work out. It remains a mystery why these three young men, veterans of the same training and the same crash, differed so radically in their perceptions of their plight. Maybe the difference was biological. Some men may be wired for optimism, others for doubt. As a toddler, Louis had leapt from a train and watched it bear his family away, yet had remained cheerfully unconcerned about his safety, suggesting that he may have been a born optimist. Perhaps the men's history had given them opposing convictions about their capacity to overcome adversity. Phil and Louis had survived Funafuti and performed uncommonly well over Nauru, and each trusted the other. If there was one thing left, he'd have given it to me, Phil once said of Louis. Mac had never seen combat, didn't know these officers, and was largely an unknown quantity to himself. All he knew about his ability to cope with the crisis was that on the first night, he had panicked and eaten the only food they had. As time passed and starvation loomed, this act took on a greater and greater importance and may have fed Mac's sense of futility. For Phil, there was another source of strength, one of which even Louis was unaware. According to his family, in his quiet, private ways, Phil was a deeply religious man, carrying a faith instilled in him by his parents. I had told Al several times before to always do his best as he knew how to do it. Phil's father once wrote, and when things get beyond his skull and ability, to ask the Lord to step in and help out. Phil never spoke of his faith, but as he sang hymns over the ocean, conjured up a protective God, perhaps rescue felt closer, despair more distant. From earliest childhood, Louis had regarded every limitation placed on him as a challenge to his wits, his resourcefulness, and his determination to rebel. The result has been a mutinous youth, as maddening as his exploits had been for his parents and his town. Louis's success in carrying them off had been given the conviction that he could think of his way out of any boundary. Now, as he was cast in extremity, despair and death became the focus of his defiance. The same attributes that had made him the boy terror of torrents were keeping him alive in the greatest struggle of his life. Though all three men faced the same hardship, their differing perceptions of it appeared to be shaping their fates. Louis and Phil's hope displaced their fear and inspired them to work toward their survival, and each success renewed their physical and emotional vigor. Mac's resignation seemed to paralyze him, and the less he participated in their efforts to survive, the more he slipped. Though he did the least as the days passed, it was he who faded the most. Louis and Phil's optimism and Mac's hopelessness were becoming self-fulfilling. 2 weeks had passed. The men's skin was burned, swollen, and cracked. Mysterious white lines stripped their fingernails and toenails, and salt sores were marching up their legs, buttocks, and backs. The rafts were decomposing in the salt, in the sun, and salt water, bleeding vivid yellow dye onto the men's clothing and skin and making everything sticky. The men's bodies slowly wasted away. Each day, Louis noticed incremental differences in his weight and the weight of his raft mates from the day before. The pants looser, the faces narrower. As they passed the fortnight mark, they began to look grotesque. Their flesh had evaporated. Their cheeks, now bearded, had sunken into concavities. Their bodies were digesting themselves. They were reaching a state of their ordeal that for their castaways had been a gruesome turning point. In 1820, after the whaling ship Essex was sunk by an enraged whale, the lifeboat-bound survivors on the brink of death resorted to cannibalism. Some 60 years later, after 19 days adrift, starving survivors of the sunken yacht Minonet killed and ate a teenage crewman. Stories of cannibalism among castaways were so common that British sailors considered the practice of choosing and sacrificing a victim to be an established custom of the sea. To well-fed men on land, the idea of cannibalism has always inspired revulsion. To many sailors who have stood on the threshold of death, lost in the agony and mind-altering effects of starvation, it had seemed a reasonable, even inescapable solution. I think they might eat Mac. For Louis, the idea of consuming a human being was revolting and unthinkable. To eat a human being, even if the person had died naturally, would be abhorrent for him. All three men held the same conviction. Cannibalism wouldn't be considered, then or ever. Ah, rats. The 2 week mark was a different kind of turning point for Louis. He began to pray out loud. He had no idea how to speak to God, so he recited snippets of prayers that he'd heard in movies. Phil bowed his head as Louis spoke, offering Amen at the end. Mac only listened. The raft slid on the current, their teachers snaking behind them. It seemed that they were still drifting west, but without any points of reference, the men weren't sure. At least they were going somewhere. The second albatross fluttered onto Louis's head sometime around the 14th day. Again, Louis slowly raised his hand, snatched it, and killed it. The men sat there looking at it, remembering the stench of the first albatross. When Louis opened it up, they were happily surprised that this one didn't smell that bad. Still, no one wanted to eat it. Louis proportioned the meat insisted that everyone eat. All three men forced the meat down. Because Max seemed to need the most food, they gave him all the blood. In the bird's stomach they found several small fish, which they decided to use as bait, and with them Louis caught one more fish. He saved some of the bird meat for bait and set the bones out to dry in hopes that they might be useful as fish hooks. Wow, talk about resourcefulness. Time spun out endlessly. Louis caught a few fish, once paralyzing a tiny one, thrown into the raft by a whitecap into bait that yielded a comparatively fat pilot fish. Rains came intermittently, leaving the men sucking up every drop that fell into their rain catchers. Louis and Phil took turns leading prayers each night. Mac remained in his own world. The men grew thinner. Phil was gradually regaining his strength after his initial state of concussed exhaustion. Mac's body grew weaker following his broken spirit. Then the rain stopped and the water tins dried up. They reached day 21. They caught a fish and had a little celebration for passing what they thought was Rickenbacker's mark. For some time, Louis had noticed a stomach-turning reek wafting to and fro them. It was coming from Phil's head. The blood on his t-shirt bandage was rotting, and cakes of it were chipping off and falling into the raft. Phil couldn't smell it, but Louis couldn't bear it. Louis untied the t-shirt and gently unwrapped it. Beneath a thick cake of dry blood, the wounds had knit neatly. The bleeding didn't resume. The t-shirt could go. A few days later, Louis saw something bizarre. The edge of the sea, flush to the horizon, was peeling forward. A vast black rim formed, rose up, and began speeding toward them with a tumbling motion. Louis shouted a warning, and the other two men wheeled around toward it. They dropped down, getting their weight as low as possible so they wouldn't be flipped over. As the wave closed in, they braced themselves. Just as the wave reached them, they realized it wasn't a wave at all. It was a giant school of dolphins swimming with astonishing speed. The dolphins rushed at the rafts and were soon muscling all around them, looking into the water. Phil saw small fish, thousands of them, seeming to fill the ocean. The dolphins were chasing them. The men thrust their arms into the water and tried to grab some, but the fish slipped through their fingers. If they had a net, then they whisked it through the water and filled the rafts, but with only their fingers, they couldn't snag even one. Louis was out of bait. Other than the sharks, the only fish that ventured near the rafts were pilotfish, which hung the sides of the shark as they circled. They were within easy reach, only when Louis tried to grab them, they squirted away. The sharks had stolen every hook small enough to fit in their mouths of pilotfish, so Louis tried albatross bones, but the fish spat them out. Looking at the fish line that had left, he had an idea. He cut off small portions of the line, tied them to the large fish hooks, and then tied these hooks to the fingers of one hand, one on his pinky, one on his middle finger, one on his thumb, orienting them as if they were the claws. He held them over his hand over the water's surface and waited. A shark, attended by pilotfish, swam by once. Once it headed past, Louis sank his hand in the water. When the unsuspecting pilotfish moved under his hand, he snapped his fingers shut around its back. The hooks dug in. Louis yanked the fish out of the water, jubilant. Sometimes that week, a small tern landed on the wall of the raft, right between the men. It was closest to Phil, and without speaking, the men indicated to each other that he'd catch it. Phil clapped down on the bird. It was tiny and offered little meat, but not long after, another tern settled in the raft. This time, Matt caught it. Louis was so famished that he went at it with his teeth, ripping the feathers loose and spitting them out in woofs. Almost immediately, he felt a crawling sensation on his chin. The tern had been covered in lice, which were now hopping over his face. Something about the tickle of lice on his skin rattled Louis more than anything he had yet encountered. He began scratching and rubbing at his face, but he couldn't get at the lice, which had burrowed into his beard and were moving up his head into his hair. He pitched his upper body into the water. Phil and Mac, realizing that Louis was going to get his head ripped off, grabbed the oars and bumped the sharks away while Louis splashed about, trying to drown the lice. After about half a dozen dunks, the tickle was gone. As the days passed, the men caught 3, perhaps 4 more birds. One bird kept dipping low over the raft and soaring off again. Mac suddenly shot his hand up and snagged the bird by the leg in mid-air, then handed the squirming animal to Louis, who was amazed at Mac's alacrity. The men ate every morsel of the bird and every other bird they caught, leaving only feathers and bones. They were hungry. For days, Louis lay over the side of the raft, fish hooks tied to his fingers, trying to catch another pilotfish. He caught none. The water ran out again, and thirst was agonizing. Day after day passed with no rain. Twice the men rowed toward distant squalls, but each time the rain sputtered out just as they reached it, leaving them exhausted and demoralized. When the next squall inched along the horizon, none of them had enough strength to chase it. The intense thirst and overheating drove Phil to do something almost suicidal. He waited for the sharks to wander a short distance away, then pulled himself overboard. Louis and Mac knelt near him, jabbing at sharks with the oars, as Phil hung over the raft, savoring the cool water and swishing big mouthfuls of it over his tongue before spitting it out. He only had the strength to drag himself back in. Since Phil had gotten away with it, the other two thought it was worth a try and took their turns in the water. The men were able to keep the sharks away long enough for all 3 to have a dip. On the 6th day without water, the men recognized that they weren't going to last much longer. Mac was failing especially quickly. They bowed their heads together as Louis prayed. If God would quench their thirst, he vowed, he'd dedicate his life to him. The next day, by divine intervention, or the fickle humors of the tropics, the sky broke open and rain poured down. Twice more the water ran out, twice more they prayed, and twice more the water came. The showers gave them just enough water to last a short while longer, if only a plane would come. That was chapter 14, Thirst, in Laura Hillenbrand's book, Unbroken. Chapter 14, I really like the ending of that. And praying helps. Praying, if you're ever in a time of trouble, even if you're not religious, just pray.